Welcome back to Radio Rothbard, the current events podcast of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. You can find our full archives on our website at mises.org. So this week we're going to talk about our stagnating economy, the threat of stagflation, and really just some of the truth about some of these economic data points that are coming out of the regime and how they don't quite reflect the true situation. And we have Peter St. Onge with us. I've known Peter for years. Like 10 years now, really.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah,
met him when it's been too long.
It was, well, you were a fellow at the Mises Institute at the time, right? 10 years too many.
That's right, yeah. That was literally 2014. Yeah, it has been about a decade now.
Mm-hmm.
But you haven't aged today, Ryan.
That's what everybody says. Yes, that is the consensus. But Peter's now with the Heritage Foundation. But of course, he's well grounded in Austrian school economics. And as we will maintain, the Austrian school provides us with some of the best tools for understanding business cycles and really understanding where we are in the business cycle and what steps come next and that sort of thing. So we'll use some of that today. And really just understanding this economic disinformation that's so common now as we're living in the age of Bidenomics. Now, for you listeners, I just wanted to know before we go on that if you are interested in these topics, of course, you might consider attending the Human Action Conference coming up on May 16 through May 18. That's going to be at the Mises Institute campus in Auburn, Alabama. This commemorates the 75th anniversary of Mises' groundbreaking work, Human Action. So there'll be plenty of talk about business cycles there, inflation, all of that sort of stuff. So if you are interested, just go to our website, mises.org, and click on events, and you can register there. So, Peter, I watch you on Twitter, and I keep abreast of what the economy is doing just on my own for my own job as well, especially the monthly releases on jobs data, inflation data. Well, by inflation, I mean CPI, so price inflation, CPI inflation. And if you dig, as we've noted, both of us, if you actually look beyond just the headline, lots of bad news in there. So let's just look at some of the basics now, and then we can kind of look at, does this point towards stagflation, which is kind of the worst case scenario in terms of where we're headed. So let's just kind of start with, we just hear constantly from the regime about how great the employment situation is. And I've noted, there's lots of part-time job growth. There's lots of wages being paid that don't keep up with price inflation. So how would you characterize the job situation right now?
Yeah, so that's been one of the things that media has been on about is basically you have two numbers, right? Joe Biden is the least popular president in modern history. He even manages to do worse than Jimmy Carter, which many of us thought could not be done. And yet, if you look at the economic numbers, right, the three most important economic numbers are going to be the jobs, so the unemployment rate, the inflation, and the GDP numbers. And if you look at those numbers, they're on paper, they're actually really good, right? The unemployment rate, I think, is 3.738, which is historically very, very low. The GDP numbers until about a week ago, they were looking very robust. So I think we had 3.9 and 3.4 for the last two quarters. That's actually very robust GDP growth. And that was real growth, right? That was even after inflation. And then inflation too, right? Again, until about a week ago, inflation was coming down just like Jerome Powell said it would. Yes, it's 2-3 years later than he predicted, but nonetheless. So these numbers were all looking amazing on paper. And then the media kept scratching their head. We're like, why does everybody hate this economy? And, I think you and I agree that the trick here is that you got to dig into the numbers a little bit. It's not a question of them just pulling numbers straight out of their hat, right? They're not just inventing these from whole cloth. It's the same game that they play across academia, which is that you can make all kinds of little assumptions, and each little assumption or definition on its own, you can kind of defend, right? You can imagine sitting in front of a bunch of other economics PhDs, and you could have an interesting discussion whether, should you seasonally adjust this? What exactly qualifies as a part-time work? If somebody's working 20 hours, is that full-time? Is it part-time? We could have a debate. Anyway, you sum up hundreds of these little discussions, and each single one of them, they're gonna move to one side rather than the other. And when you sum all those up, you're going to get an amazing world on paper. And then the reality of it is, the worst economic approval ratings in history. Okay, because people, when they go to the store, when they see their paychecks, when they see their tax rates, they look at their property taxes, their home insurance, their health insurance, they look at their mortgage costs, they look at the gas pump, right? People can see all these things. And so you get this dichotomy where real people are posting this crap on Twitter. They're showing their actual grocery bills. Maybe they dig up one from a couple of years ago and they look at them side by side. Or they go to Five Guys, they get a $25 burger, right? So you've got people are actually, experiencing the real economy, even as this paper economy makes things look a lot rosier than they are.
Yeah, and I think that's also felt in the fact that a lot of these are aggregate numbers. So they're showing overall wage growth across all income levels. And so if you've got people at the higher end doing pretty well for themselves, that tells us almost nothing about someone who's down at the working class end.
Yeah, so you've got the composition. If you look, for example, at the part-time versus full-time, so, a lot of the amazing job story over the past year has been really part-time jobs are increasing while full-time jobs are actually falling. Right now, most people in the economy, when they can only find a part-time job, that's for economic reasons. In other words, that's not because they want more leisure. That's because they can't do any better. And in fact, if you've got two part-time jobs and that's counted as two jobs, but you lost a full-time job, you're not better off, right? On paper, maybe it looks pretty astounding, but people are hurting. Part-time versus full-time. The other one is native born. There's nothing wrong with immigrants getting jobs, but the issue here is that if you've got another 100,000 jobs because people moved into your country, right? Immigrants bring their own jobs with them because they are human resources, right? So to illustrate, if we annex Canada tomorrow, God forbid, we do not have 40 million extra workers who are out there, looking for work, right? Everybody in Canada's already got a job, right? So if you bring 100,000 people in every month, which is, by the way, that's recently what the BEA estimated that's about the impact of immigrants. That, in other words, you want to take the job numbers and knock off about 100,000 for undocumented migrants. If you've got all those people coming in, that's not exactly job growth in the sense of sort of lifting all boats. That's simply saying, yeah, we got a bunch more people in the country. So if you look at native born, which includes immigrants, right? People who say first generation who were born in this country, native born employment has actually been flat since 2018, which is shocking. I mean, that's absolute stagnation. You put that side by side with the amazing Biden jobs numbers and something doesn't give. Final point is something that actually the Wall Street Journal, I was kind of impressed that they came up with this word. They called it the welfare industrial complex, by which they mean government workers and the immense sort of jobs that cling on to all this government spending, right? So social welfare, migration, of course, all of administering all these government benefits and government programs. So they called that the welfare industrial complex. They said that roughly half of all the jobs created last year were essentially government. They were paid by government. Like the economy's not getting any better. That's simply measuring what happens if you pour $2 trillion in and you aim most of that money at your constituents. Then yes, that's going to create a bunch of jobs because somebody's getting that money, but that is not prosperity, right? So you put those three things together, right? The fact that full-time jobs are being converted into part-time, the fact that native-born workers are not, they're getting literally no job growth, and then the fact that whatever jobs we do have when all that smoke clears is just being bought with deficits, and the overall picture is that the job situation is dire. In fact, we just got statistics out today that the This is from the Conference Board, which measures a variety of economic indicators. They sort of compete with government statistics. And they said that the jobs expectation index was down. It was actually the lowest since 2011. All right. So people do not think that there are plentiful jobs out there. 2011 is interesting because that was way back after the 2008 crisis. We had this really sluggish recovery where everybody was sitting around like, when are we going to recover from this stupid thing? It took like 5 years, pretty much up until 2012, until the economy really got back on its footing. So we are at the worst for jobs, by surveying actual people who are out there looking for jobs. We're at the worst since essentially the tail end of the 2008 crisis. So none of the reality on the ground, none of the surveys, none of the opinion polls, none of the numbers really, once you dig into them, are agreeing with this narrative that this is anywhere close to a good economy. So that's the job situation. Next up, you got the GDP, right? That's the other big number there. And on GDP, of course, that's a much simpler story. That's just $2 trillion in deficit spending. Yes, that's going to boost economic activity. But remember, GDP is not wealth, right? GDP just means you're looking busy. You're doing stuff. Somebody's paying you to make something, right? If you're making bombs and then you're shipping those to Ukraine, that is not making us wealthier as a country. It's not building a bridge. It's not building a car, right? That's just being wasted. So yes, we're spending a lot of money. A lot of that money is going, to people whose work is being wasted on that, but it is not actually making the country richer.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to be made. And Daniel Lacaille has covered that a bit on our site as well, is that so much of this GDP and economic activity it's just government spending. It's deficit funded. And that's a good point about the employment too. Like I calculated for our site, right, in terms of job growth that's actually explicitly government jobs, it's about 20%, which in itself is a ton.
Yeah.
And you only see that when you're kind of headed into recession. It starts to get bigger and bigger. But when you include all of those government contractors, the guys who pave highways, right? Those construction workers who create government buildings and government stuff, they're not really private sector workers, but they're listed as private sector.
Right.
And so that looks like a lot of private economic activity.
Yeah. And, if it's paving roads or repairing bridges, that's one thing. But, even if we look at the infrastructure bill from a couple of years ago, they slapped the name infrastructure on that, and every government contractor who's paving a road, they actually put up signs, right? They say, this is paid by your tax. They announce that loud and clear. You almost wonder if they tell them to work slow so, you can show all the commuters that some of this money actually goes to the government. Well, sure. Now, when you actually look at these $6 trillion they're spending in Washington, right, almost none of it is going to anything like that. The infrastructure bill a couple of years ago, that ended up going to all these interest groups. It went to green solar, it went to handouts for cronies. Almost none of it is actually going to the road construction. The vast majority is going to, frankly, social welfare. There's one statistic that if you look at social welfare spending by the federal government, so pre-pandemic, that was about $3 trillion. Okay, so it was about 2/3 of what the government spends. During the pandemic, that went up by about $800 billion in, what are we looking at, 40 years. That's 30%, right? So the vast majority of that welfare industrial complex is just what it looks like. It is government, specifically the left, taking care of its own, spending enormous amounts of money to ensure that its constituents are going to get out there and keep voting for it. It's not highways, it's not bridges. That stuff's all falling apart. To the extent that money even goes into those sectors, it's going to generally be rated. It's going to be passed over to unions or to government bureaucrats. It's like once you pass a dollar through that deep state, you're going to get pennies coming out the other end. And those pennies are going to have a big, giant sign on them. Your government at work for you. And it is pennies.
Well, it's interesting, too. Looking obviously at one of the core demographics out there, when we think just from the political landscape, obviously, younger voters is a demographic that Democrats have relied upon. They've been putting all their resources into trying to amplify the vote there.
Yeah.
And yet, if you look at the concerns right now for Americans 18 to 29, inflation is the top priority out there. It trumps, Palestine, Israel dynamics there and everything that's going on college campuses. It tops significantly student debt, obviously seen as one of those big generational issues. And so just the extent to which those inflationary concerns, that economic anxiety, I mean, inflation really is the most populous issue, and the fact that, it affects every single person, every single day. They have that constant reminder. The fact that you actually have an entire generation that, in spite of all of the, all the distractions, all the social issues, everything that's been pumped into getting people to focus on other shiny objects, the state of that economy for younger voters is something that cannot be ignored right now. That's why we're giving away 100,000 copies of What Has Government Done to Our Money, trying to reach those people. If anyone out there is interested in getting them for their own students, for any groups out there, you can go to Mises.org/money. But again, this is a huge opportunity because of just how much in the forefront inflation really is, I think, the political issue. And of course, it's one of those dynamics that neither political party right now has any sort of thing to really say outside of, Republicans complaining, oh, well, Bidenomics, look at all this spending while continuing to pass bills with majority Democrat support, right? And it is the most important political issue, and yet any sort of political will to have any serious substance for it, outside of Senator Mike Lee talking about ending the Fed right now, I'll take that as a step in the right direction. But obviously, this is still a minority opinion amongst even the Republicans on the other side within DC at this moment.
Yeah, really, it's like the house is collapsing, and instead of fixing the roof or maybe patching a window or something, you've got a parent who's just buying like dollar store toys to distract the kid for a minute and take their mind off it, right? We don't have any heat, we don't have any food, the roof is leaking, but hey, look, I got you this toy. It's like the media is trying to distract, whether it's global warming, whether it's the race crap, the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? It's just distraction after distraction. And the thing is, the roof is collapsing, and young people can see this. So they are giving up. There was a statistic out recently where if you look at each generation and you ask, at age 30, were they doing better than their parents? Okay. So for boomers, that was 80%. Okay. 80% of boomers were doing better than their parents at age 30. For Gen X, it was 60%. For millennials, it's right on the line of 50%, okay, meaning that we have broken the golden goose, right? All the way back through the colonial era, every generation did much better than their parents, right? Their parents would look at the young and they would say, the possibilities you have today, if only in my age we could imagine doing all this. That is gone now, okay? You've got millennials now. They sit there, they're 40 years old, they're eating ramen with the roommates. They haven't got the vaguest hope of building a family or buying a house or, which is really, in the Fed-dominated economy, you got to have a house because you got to hook onto that rocket sled. All right, they've got no hope of ever catching up. But instead, they sit there and they look at their parents and think, how the heck did you guys do it? How did you own a house? Right? You were married, we could afford vacations. We could go to Disney World. How the heck did you do it? So instead, what these people are doing is just completely giving up. They're going into the dink lifestyle, double income, no kids. You see these videos up on TikTok where they're celebrating. They're like, you with your children. Look at me. I've got my avocado toast here in Bali. Right? It's just this completely nihilistic mindset where the kids, they're so far behind, they've just given up. They're not even going to try to build anything. They're just going to run it out. And I don't know, maybe a miracle will happen. Maybe the government will give them a universal basic income. Maybe, we go from debt forgiveness to, handouts for the young. They've got their hopes pinned on these socialist solutions. And of course, what those solutions are going to do, going back to that leaking roof, those are going to completely collapse the house. So they don't understand that their future is already being gutted, and the solutions that come out of Washington are going to make it even worse. It's not going to be, a question of looking up to your parents. I mean, you can have a dramatic change in living standards. I remember years ago in the 1990s, I was living in Argentina, and I took a taxi, and the guy was like a former physics professor. Now he's driving a taxi, and he was talking about how he was very sad because his son had trouble reading. Okay, so this guy was like a PhD physicist, but he had to work. And so his son was off in the government schools and his son had trouble reading, right? That is an experience. In Argentina, they know that, right? There's a lot of countries where they know that because they've given the government so much power that they've just absolutely destroyed the economy. I fear that we are coming to that in the US now, where we're starting to get this almost Latin America style economy, where you've got these dramatic differences in wealth, even within generations, where the way to get ahead is to choose your parents wisely. It's not to work hard. It's just to get lucky on the parent lottery. And where, it's not a question of stopping the progress of each generation, where we actually start to get this retrogression where young people are just almost living in a completely different reality than their parents did.
Well, let's look at one of the worst scenarios we can look at here, which is stagflation. As long as we're talking about all the wonderful things that are in store. Now, of course, you and I are old enough to remember a couple previous cycles, right? We remember that recessions are bad, that they're tough in terms of finding work, that sometimes you have to move around, and especially when you're younger, right? And everybody wants 10 years of experience enduring times of recession, and you don't have it. And it's very depressing. And this occurred in 2002. And also, 2001 and what came soon, right after that. And then also of course, the Great Recession. And if you're just a few years older than me, you could even remember the early 2000s recession, kind of a big deindustrializing period back then. But in those periods, they were fairly standard recessions in the sense that, you had big job losses, but prices also went down a bit. And they came out of it in a fairly normal situation. It was not like the 70s, which our parents remember, which is where you had both a slowing economy and high rising unemployment and price. You didn't get any relief on the prices. And so that's increasingly the danger that I'm seeing from our fellows and from other observers, is that there's a real danger of stagflation here. Why is there a danger of stagflation now? And it didn't pan out in the most recent other two regular recessions.
Yeah, so stagflation is fairly terrifying. We haven't seen it in a long time, right? The last time we got it was 1970s. And what it looked like in the 1970s was you had double-digit inflation for years and years on end, not just 1 year like we just had, but years and years. And that was paired with double-digit unemployment for years and years on end. And I mean, that is absolutely catastrophic. I think for the young people, especially, 1970s is kind of cool because of the outrageous looks and whatnot. It was horrific, right? I mean, cities were they were like hellscapes. You can find these old movies from back then, like Escape from New York. And those were documentaries, man. I mean, it was absolutely horrific. When we look at what's happening in New York right now, we're still a far sight from that. And I think that, at the time, people, the promise was never again, right? They were never going to screw the pooch that bad. And they have, which, I don't think many of us imagine that. Okay, so what happened this time is really the same thing that happened in the 1970s, which is that they poured out so much spending that it just absolutely overwhelmed the numbers. Okay, so in the wake of COVID, there was one point where $1 in $3 had fresh ink on it, all right? Almost $1 in $3 had been printed since the beginning of COVID. It was absolutely out of control. Those are the kinds of inflation numbers that we really haven't seen since the late 1960s. Back then, it was guns and butters, right? They wanted to run the Vietnam War, do their little, venture capital wars all over the world, and they wanted to roll out the so-called Great Society, which devastated the inner cities. But at any rate, they did that. They followed it to the T. And what happened next in the 1970s is that inflation took off. It hit double digits. The Fed freaked out. It hiked rates. That seemed to have brought the inflation down. So at that point, the Fed declared victory. Good job, guys. And they brought rates back down, okay, because the economy was starting to slow. And that's, the standard cookbook at the Fed, right? So if inflation gets out of control, you raise the rates. You do that long enough to kill the inflation, but then you got to lower rates again so that you can get the economy growing again with the cheap money and the sort of tissue fire boom. All right, so that's their standard recipe. That's what they did in the 70s. Problem is they cut too soon. They had failed to control for how much money had been spent during the Great Society and Vietnam projects. And so it just came roaring right back, right? It was almost like not taking enough antibiotics, right? You've got an infection, you take antibiotics, maybe you take one pill and then you're like, these are disgusting, forget that stuff. And it just comes roaring back and it's much, much worse. In fact, it can be life-threatening. So in that case, in the 70s, you got this second wind where, it just absolutely took off. You had close to 5 years of double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. And that finally ended when they got Paul Volcker in there. And Paul Volcker, he was actually appointed by Jimmy Carter, which is hilarious because Jimmy Carter is a super easy money guy. You never would have expected. I guess he didn't know what he was getting. And anyway, Paul Volcker hiked rates to almost 20%, crashed the economy, absolutely savage pair of twin recessions. At the time, they were the worst since the Depression, catastrophic, but it did the job. Inflation came back down, and then you got the 1980s boom that we all love and remember. If you watch American Psycho, you get a very nice, I mean, not everything in that movie is accurate, but kind of gives you a picture of the era. So anyway, what we've done so far, apparently, is that the Fed has managed to copy their exact game plan word for word, right? So they poured out this, I think it was 6 or 7 trillion that they poured out during COVID in order to bribe voters into accepting lockdowns. And then, that made inflation take off. So the Fed did its thing. It ramped up interest rates. And then at that point, the inflation, the peak inflation started coming down. And they said, okay, job done, mission accomplished. And they stopped with the hikes, right? So now we're getting these numbers. This is just a couple of days ago. We got numbers where apparently the GDP is slowing. So it's down to 1.6% annualized. That's fairly slow, right? I mean, given the population growth in this country, that's probably pretty darn close to stagnation. But on top of that, the annualized core PCE, that's the Fed's kind of goal-seeked favorite measure of inflation. It's kind of the friendliest one. It grades on a curve. Even the core PCE almost doubled, right? So it went from 2% annualized to 3.7. Now you take that together, and that is a perfect stagnation storm, right? In other words, what it means is that the Fed stopped too early. Inflation is kicking back up. We're getting that exact 1970s pattern where they stopped too early. They, let their foot off the brake, and now inflation is jumping again. My concern is that where do we go from here? So if we get back to that 1970s scenario where we're looking at, ultimately double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, how is Washington going to fix it this time, right? The problem is Washington is dumb, but they're not that dumb. They look back at the 1970s, and the story that they understand is that Paul Volcker ended the inflation, sure, but he also cost Jimmy Carter the election, right? So they are not going to do that again. They're not going to take one for the team. And that's something we've seen across Washington, right? Everybody in Washington and on Wall Street knows that the deficits, the debt, it's unsustainable. But nobody is going to take one for the team. Nobody's going to be the sacrifice. Nobody's going to be the first one to jump in and fight the fire because there's a good chance you'll die, right? Your career will be destroyed. Your organization will be ruined. So nobody's jumping in to do any of this. So I think if we get back to the 70s, the sort of freakish good luck that we had from Paul Volcker, that's not going to repeat. Everybody involved with making that decision knows exactly what happened with Paul Volcker, which is that he cost the Democrats not just the election, he cost them the Senate. He ushered in Reagan. It was a complete transformation of the country. I think they're going to keep kicking the can down the road. They're just going to hope and pray. They're going to run with their, Mr. Putin did it. It was the supply chains. God, they had so many excuses. It was global warming did it, right? They're just going to keep running with that. They've got a compliant press now. That's something that the press was pretty left-wing in the 70s, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. I mean, now it just completely carries the water. Actually, to a sort of scary degree, speaking of disinformation, they'll peddle any lie at this point. So I'm concerned that if the Fed does get us back to a 70s place with years and years of stagflation, I have no idea how we're going to get out of it. We are not going to get a Volcker this time.
So, Tho Bishop, the question for you, being our election person, is will this affect the election? I mean, will the voters catch on that the economy is getting worse, or will it be just obvious come November and it'll deeply impact Biden in spite of their efforts to kick the can down the road? Are they running out of time in spite of what they're doing and how they think they can manage the situation?
Well, as Peter mentioned, I mean, Biden is in the worst state an incumbent has been in at this point in the calendar. And of course, what we're seeing is a doubling down of the lawfare aspect, bringing Trump in front of court, really laying in, they're going to use every vessel possible to play into the democracy is at threat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera issue. And the question is going to be those moderate, independent swing voters, if you will. And you're seeing more and more of the Joe Rogan crowd, just to put it as simply as possible, that are, I think, a lot more Trump favorable outwardly than they were in 2016 or 2020, because again, that anxiety is very real. It's something that everyone feels, and again, that's why I think it's so interesting looking at the 18 to 29-year-old numbers, because again, if any group is going to be the most disconnected in many ways from those real world concerns, it would be that group. And yet, again, so many of the more ideological projects, you still play it out if you filter it down by self-described Democrats. Obviously, those numbers change a great deal. You'll have concerns about abortion access and things like that. Those will rise up the ranks. But if you look at, again, particularly those non-partisan, non-self-describing partisan voters, that's where the economic issues are really at the forefront. Now, again, how that plays out in November is a wild card there, just because of we know the lengths the regime will go in order to maintain power there. And of course, the secondary question for that is that if you do have a change of who sits in the White House, what will that actually end up in policy? And one of the things I do find interesting, though, is when it involves the crypto industry. Because this was obviously an industry. I remember Trump tweeting at night. I think it was like 2019 or so. Don't buy Bitcoin, right? He was bashing Bitcoin, and yet this is one area, one tangible area where you can see, in terms of the political landscape, you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who has made that a big part of his campaign. You're seeing a lot of those figures. Being a lot more friendly to, let's say, the Mar-a-Lago crowd. And I think that's one of those dynamics, and Peter can comment on this, I think, a great deal, is that one of the DC's reactions to this economic stress is, not only is there a lack of political will to deal with the spending side of it, not only, is the Fed playing this game of, trying to gaslight exactly when interest rates that everyone is desperate for, just so that, certain lending rates go down, and yet they recognize that inflation's not cooperating the way they want. One of the areas where we have seen a very renewed effort from the DC sphere is a crackdown on the crypto industry, both with actions taken by the SEC, both with going after wallets and custodian aspects of the industry. I mean, yes, we had an approved ETF for Bitcoin earlier this year, but everything else that's come from DC, Caitlin Long and the issues that she's had with Custodia Bank getting an account with the Fed, there has been an increased effort. Operation Choke Point 2.0. There has been a increased hostility from the Biden regime, aided by the worst of the worst in the Democrats in the Senate. But this has been one of the major battlefields going on behind the scenes in terms of the legislative side, which I think all points to, again, recognizing that when you have this inflationary environment, what are people looking to as alternatives? Crypto being one of those. And I think that is one of the areas where you can see the weakness, the fear, the concerns from the regime on the policy side of things, beyond simply what polling might indicate, and kind of the concerns about what we plebs might be feeling out there.
Yeah, I think so far a lot of the emphasis out of DC has been on the carrot, right? It's been on the spending, $1 billion for you, $1 trillion for you. And at this point, they're starting to shift over to the stick, right? So, we're seeing a lot of tax proposals coming out. Biden just proposed, $4.9 trillion in new taxes. He's proposing a 45% capital gains tax, 25% on unrealized gains, which is would be catastrophic for the economy. And, of course, one of the things in the crosshairs is going to be Bitcoin, the competition. They, hate the fact that people can transact in some medium that they don't control. I mean, frankly, they hate the fact that they don't control anything, right? Freedom is the competition for the government, fundamentally. They want men to be slaves. They don't want men to be free. They lose their superpowers. But I think that that's going to be the theme going forward here, certainly after the election. What I think is kind of amazing is that Biden is sitting here floating 45% capital gains before the election. So you can imagine what's going to come out of Washington if they stuff enough ballots and he gets in for a second term. I mean, it's they've already talked about wealth taxes. I can imagine a UBI pairing on with that. A UBI is very, very popular with the median voter, especially if you've managed to bankrupt them, especially with young people, right? If they've got no job prospects, then that's very, very appealing to come here and say, well, I'll just give you $2,000 every month. How's that sound, big fella? So that would be student loan forgiveness times 10. So I think we could start to see both the sticks coming after what's left of the productive economy and just an absolute tsunami of additional spending to try to buy votes, just to wring out one more day of raiding the Treasury before the whole thing collapses.
Well, and this is the dangerous situation out there is that, what will be the selling point, what Biden will be selling is, we need to tax these rich guys, and there'll be various, narratives about why unrealized capital gains taxes are good, or why taxing crypto bros is good. And they'll say, well, we have to do this because we're the grown-ups in the room. Don't you see we have a massive spending problem? Don't you see these deficits? In order to deal with this, we need to handle the revenue side. And again, what is the Republicans' counter argument right now? Again, that's a dangerous thing, is that what should be the most powerful tool that could happen for political change in this country is dealing with this inflationary crisis that is concerning people. But there's no credibility on the other side. The narratives there is more unfunded tax cuts, right? More of this. That is the problem, is that, again, they're going to try to present this as, okay, we recognize that you're feeling the inflationary pain. We're no longer going to dismiss it. We're going to no longer say it's transitory. The answer is going to be, well, if you want to stop your inflationary campaign, we're going to need to have the stick of these higher tax rates. And again, there's such a lack of will on the other side. I mean, you've got maybe 30 members of Congress and the Senate combined that have been voting against these insane budgets and the like, right? That is the difficulty, is that there is no serious political operation in D.C. dealing with these with this economic game at the same time as it is the most powerful electoral issue there. And it sometimes will change. You can see different levels. At the state level, there's more effective governance down there. But in D.C., you have a total clown show right now with a Republican-controlled Congress that is creating a very dangerous environment. Again, then you add into it the lawfare, you add into it all the breaks with political norms out there, and you have a very, very dangerous recipe for what 2025 could look like.
Yep.
All right. Well, with that, I think we better wrap up.
Right.
So much good news we've left you with, dear listener. But I mean, so much is up in the air right now. It is a period of danger. The question is, will they stuff enough ballots, right, this fall? But then what happens?
Yeah, that's always the question. There was just a poll out in the past couple of days that said that 55% of Americans say that the Trump presidency was good. 39% say that the Biden presidency is good. Now, generally speaking, in polls, questions like that are really good proxies for which candidate you like, right? Because if you don't like Trump, you don't like anything about Trump, right? He feeds fish the wrong way on down the line, right? So that's a 16-point gap. That's a big deal. But on the other hand, if you look at the betting markets, like Predictit and those guys, you've got at best neck and neck, right? So, I mean, there's one heck of a gap between the polling and the predictions of what actually is going to happen. And that's the ballot stuffers. They put a ton of money into that. I think, people who sort of jump on the, onto the Brandon meme, a lot of people hate him, but that's not really the question, right? This isn't a complete democracy, people. You've got to overwhelm the margin of cheating. But I will say one thing, I know that a lot of the stuff we discuss here is pretty dire, but I mean, it is important to remember we have been through much, much worse. We survived the 1970s. We survived Wilson and FDR, for God's sakes. We have been through much worse. I mean, never mind, the butcher in 1864 there. So we have been through much, much worse in this country. I mean, we're going to be just fine. Yes, a lot of paper money will be destroyed. There's going to be a lot of misery between here and there. It'd be really nice if we didn't have to go through this. But absolutely, I mean, the American people have been through some hard stuff, and we get through it.
Yeah, and so if you are young and you're listening, well, you've got something to do with your life. You're in no danger of just sitting back and wasting your life on nothing. You have a mission, my friends. And so with that, we'll go ahead.
You won't be bored.
If there are any young people out there that want to strengthen themselves in this mission and prepare for the hard times ahead, we do have open enrollment still for Mises University, which you can apply at mises.org/events, which might provide not only good information and a framework to understand what comes ahead, but also a good network of contacts that can help you build up from there as well, which your personal network might be one of the most important assets that you have in the coming decades with all this economic stress out there. So again, never a better place to make good contacts with people your own age.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, we will be back next week with a new episode, and this is your opportunity to build up what you need to know now for your future activism. Yes, thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and we'll see you next time.